Economics of regulation. Compared to the earlier two readings in economics, this is going to be relatively short. So here is what we are going to cover: a basic overview of regulation, regulation of commerce, regulation of financial markets. Since we are preparing for the CFA exam, there is a separate section on the regulation of financial markets. A few words on cost-benefit analysis of regulation, and finally analysis of regulation. The introduction simply sets the context for this reading, and the basic idea is that regulation can have an impact on the macroeconomic picture. It can have an impact on a particular industry, and regulation can also have an impact on specific companies. And hence, from an analyst perspective, it is important to understand the sorts of regulations that are in place, the sorts of regulations that might be enforced, and the impact of those regulations on the companies or entities that are being analyzed. So let's now move to section 2 of the reading, which talks about the classification of regulations and regulators. There is a fair amount said in the curriculum. What I am doing here is taking out what I believe is the most important part and items that are most testable. So first, some basic thoughts on where do regulations come from? Who makes these regulations? So one entity that can make regulation or essentially rules is the legislative body in a country. Now in the US, the legislative body would be the US Congress. When they make laws or enact laws, those laws are called statutes. And a classic example of a recent statute is the Dodd-Frank Act. And this is mentioned quite often in this reading, so I think you need to know this particular statute. Number two, in addition to legislative bodies, we also have regulatory bodies which issue administrative regulations, and these regulatory bodies are often also responsible for implementing statutes that have been enacted by the legislative bodies. Within regulatory bodies, we can either have government agencies or independent regulators. In the US, for example, the Securities and Exchange Commission is a government agency which basically oversees the capital markets. Now, independent regulators are not part of the government, but they are recognized by the government and given authority by the government. So independent regulators also then are essentially responsible for regulating a given set of companies or industry. Now, within independent regulators, we have a category called self-regulating organizations, which I think from an exam perspective is important. There are several questions in the curriculum on self-regulating organizations, so I will cover this separately on the next slide. Now, moving on and talking about regulations, sometimes a law or a regulation might require some interpretation. That interpretation is provided by the courts, and the interpretation that comes from the court on either a statute or on an administrative regulation, that interpretation in essence becomes the law. So when this process takes place through a court, then the court's interpretation essentially is called judicial law. In terms of different kinds of laws, we have either substantive laws or procedural laws. A substantive law focuses on the rights and responsibilities of entities and the relationship between entities. A procedural law focuses on protection and enforcement of substantive laws. Now, the curriculum doesn't spend much time giving examples on substantive law and procedural law, so I would just take these definitions and remember them. Now, in terms of self-regulating organizations or SROs, these essentially represent a given set of entities or members, and SROs also regulate members. So, some examples of SROs. In the US, a major example is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, or FINRA. The mission of this entity is to protect American investors by making sure that securities industry operates fairly and honestly. Now, this particular entity has the authority to enforce rules. Another SRO is the International Organization of Securities Commissions, or IOSCO. This entity basically is an umbrella organization which oversees the regulators or the security regulators across different countries. So within the IOSCO, you will have regulators such as the SEC in the US and the basic financial market regulatory authorities across different countries. Here, obviously, the IOSCO cannot regulate and cannot enforce the rules, but it provides standards and guidelines and best practices for these entities like the SEC, which in turn can regulate and enforce rules. In terms of a self-regulating organization, for an SRO to be truly effective and viewed as being a suitable regulator, there needs to be adequate oversight by a government regulator. If there isn't adequate oversight from the government regulator perspective, then there is a risk that the SRO will essentially look after the interest of the members rather than regulating them. And in fact, post the 2008 financial crisis, the self-regulating organizations have come under a lot of scrutiny. As a high-level remark, the level of authority with SROs varies. You probably got a sense of that from the two examples that I spoke about earlier, FINRA and IOSCO, but there is actually the level of authority that a SRO has spans a spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, you might have a situation where the SRO has the authority to enforce rules. At the other end of the spectrum, you might have a SRO that simply provides best practices, guidelines, and standards, and so on. When you take a look at example 1 in the curriculum, there is an example of a SRO in France which simply provides guidelines and best practices but does not have the authority to actually enforce rules. Section 2.2, Economic Rationale for Regulation. The basic point made in this section is that in a market where we have externalities and informational efficiencies, that is what creates the need for regulation. Let's just understand this through some simple examples, such as pollution. Now, a given factory, for example, or a given industry, let's say the chemicals industry, might create byproducts that pollute the environment, pollute the river that flows outside the factory. So now obviously this example of pollution clearly creates a negative externality which hurts the environment or hurts society in general. So if the company or the set of companies in this chemical industry are not regulated, there might be an incentive to keep polluting. So clearly regulation is required to limit or to minimize the amount of negative externality that is created. In terms of informational frictions, this basically refers to the different level of information that different stakeholders might have. So insiders at a large public company will obviously have more information about the company relative to regular investors or small investors. So clearly there needs to be regulation that limits the buying and selling that can be done by insiders. So clearly the informational friction that I just mentioned creates the need for regulation. Obviously, when regulation is defined and enforced, the regulator should keep in mind that overall the regulation should benefit society, and to determine whether the regulation is truly benefiting society, there is a need for a cost benefit analysis, and this concept is covered later in this reading. Now, a few important terms that you need to understand from an exam perspective. One is regulatory capture. This essentially refers to a situation where the regulatory authority is in essence dominated by people or by vested interests from the industry that is being regulated. And I alluded to this in the context of SROs, but the basic danger is that if the regulator becomes too business friendly or too friendly or biased towards the industry or companies that he's regulating, then obviously that hurts society. So we need to be careful that regulatory capture not take place. Regulatory competition refers to the fact where you might have different regulators who are competing with each other. So a simple example of this might be that you have multiple states in a given country, and let's say each of those states have some laws related to companies or laws related to mergers and acquisitions. Now, what different states might do is compete with each other because every state wants companies to incorporate in their state. So the state-wise regulators might compete with each other to bring in entities. And again, in the grand scheme of things, this is not favorable. This might not benefit society. Next is regulatory arbitrage. This refers to situations where entities might exploit differences in economic substance and regulatory interpretation, or it might refer to situations where an entity takes advantage or exploits differences in regulation between different regions. So one example is that in the US, the Dodd-Frank Act has called for derivatives reforms to be fully resolved by the middle of 2011, whereas the G20 countries in Europe call for something similar to happen by the end of 2012. So clearly there is an opportunity for some entities to take advantage of this difference and perhaps take some of their derivatives transactions to Europe, where the more strict regulation will come in at a later point in time. So that is a simple example of regulatory arbitrage. From an exam perspective, I don't think you need to get too deep into this. Another concept that you need to be aware of is prudential supervision. This refers to a situation where regulators, and specifically bank supervisors, worry about the financial stability of the overall system and essentially are trying to reduce the system-wide risk. So that is prudential supervision. Now, the points made above highlight the fact that we need to consider the interdependence in actions and potentially conflicting objectives of regulators. So again, the example of the Dodd-Frank Act, which requires derivatives reforms to be fully resolved by 2011 versus the G20 action which calls for something similar to happen by 2012. Now, potentially This will create an impact whereby certain entities will move their business to Europe or find it favorable to move to Europe to take advantage of differences. So both from a regulator perspective, as well as an analyst who is analyzing the impact of regulations, one needs to consider the interdependence and the potentially conflicting objectives of regulators. Next, we talk about the tools that are available to regulators, and you have, I'm sure, seen these before. So one basic tool is, or one basic category is price mechanisms, such as taxes, tariffs, subsidies. So if, for example, you take the cigarette industry, which has heavy negative externalities, one of the controls or price mechanisms that can be used is to tax the cigarette industry. If you want to discourage foreign goods in your country, you can impose tariffs. If a given industry has immense positive externalities, you might want to subsidize them. So these are examples of price mechanisms. Another category is where you restrict activities, and examples there are restricting insider trading and short selling. So insider trading is restricted by the SEC because of the informational frictions. So obviously the SEC wants to uphold the integrity of capital markets, and one of the regulations or actions to uphold the integrity of capital markets is to disallow insider trading. Another category is to mandate activities. Now, in the banking sector, it is mandated that banks need to maintain a certain minimum amount of capital. This is rather obvious, but in areas where we have high positive externalities, such as with public goods, we will have the provision of public goods and the public financing of private projects. Again, this is when we have high positive externalities. And in the context of regulatory tools, the ability to impose sanctions on violators is also significant. So these bullet points fall within the category of regulatory tools. Now, some general remarks. Lawmakers need to worry about systematic risk and financial contagion. Systematic risk refers to the risk associated with the overall financial system. Now, if a particular entity such as AIG is at risk or has an issue, given the importance of that entity in the financial system and the fact that if a large company such as AIG gets into trouble, the potential impact that will have on the whole financial system, that is an example of systematic risk. And lawmakers need to worry about how to minimize this risk. Financial contagion refers to a situation where the financial issues or problems in one region can carry over to other regions. So again, the basic point is that lawmakers need to worry about these elements and worry about how to mitigate them. The Dodd-Frank Act, which has been mentioned a few times, attempts to mitigate systematic risk. The derivatives example that I gave earlier is just one element within the Dodd-Frank Act. So the guiding principles are as follows: to maintain a stable regulatory environment. Now, stable doesn't mean that the regulatory environment does not change. It simply means that regulations should be predictable. In other words, we should not have regulations that take the industry or society by surprise, because that creates uncertainty. So regulations should be predictable, they should be effective. So whatever the objective of that regulation is, those objectives should be met. That's what makes the regulation effective. They should be consistent over time. Again, this relates to predictable. And regulations should be enforceable. If there is a regulation that cannot be enforced, then that brings into question the value of that regulation. Now, I want you to pause this video and focus your energy on example 1. It's not very difficult. As long as you've understood the basic points covered so far and apply a little bit of common sense, you will not have any issues doing example 1. Section 3, Regulation of Commerce. Now, as you might imagine, this is a very broad area, and we really need a framework that identifies the potential areas of regulation. Now, IOSCO, which we've mentioned before, has actually created a framework which is not exhaustive, but what you see here is that proposed framework that is quite useful both for regulators as well as analysts who are evaluating the potential impact of regulation. So this framework talks about the different areas that should be considered when regulations are being enacted. So we need to consider company law related items, the commercial code, taxation, bankruptcy and insolvency laws, competition laws. So obviously we want to prevent anti-competitive practices and so on. Banking law, the need for minimum capital requirements, the need to try to make the banking industry as stable as possible, dispute resolution systems. So these are some core elements. From an analyst perspective, someone who is trying to determine the impact of regulation on a given company or a given industry, he needs to look at which laws are in effect, what regulations are in effect, the impact they are having. And if he is looking at a framework such as this, he might, for example, notice that in a given country, competitive laws are possibly missing, and he needs to evaluate the likelihood of these laws coming into effect at a later point in time, and then the impact that this would have on the entities that he is studying. So again, thinking in the context of a framework is useful both for regulators as well as for financial analysts. Another point to consider is that when we talk about regulation of commerce, we need to understand that regulatory decisions can happen at many levels. So for example, when we talk about regulation around pollution, so these regulations would involve both local and international considerations. So the example I gave earlier about a given industry polluting the rivers, so there would be a local concern. But what about industries that are emitting gases that are harmful to the environment? Now, with those sorts of emissions, obviously the impact goes beyond the boundaries of a country, and there we will need to have international organizations that help decide how to address the problem. Similarly, with intellectual property protection or IPP, there are issues within a country, but then there are also international considerations. So technology developed in the United States, for example, what if it is being copied in China? Now, that raises larger global issues that need to be addressed in the context of regulating commerce. Now, interestingly, we might have situations where governments want to encourage competition within their countries, but they want to limit competition from other countries. So again, this raises questions about what are the suitable regulations that need to be enacted. Section 4, Regulation of Financial Markets. Now, the main points here are as follows. Perhaps the most important point is that we want regulation that maintains the integrity of financial markets. Now, this should sound a little familiar with the ethics segment of your course, where again, one of the most important items to consider is that people should follow practices that maintain the integrity of financial markets. So that clearly is an objective of regulation. Another major item here is mitigating agency problems. So when there is an incentive for managers to act in their own self-interest rather than the interest of the principal or the owner, that creates issues. So we want regulations that mitigate that problem, and corporate governance oriented regulations try to address that. We want regulations that give us financial stability and economic growth. So certain capital requirements, maintaining risk levels below a certain threshold, and so on, encourage financial stability. Encouraging economic growth is obvious for any country. Next, now these are general items. Generally, the focus has been on retail investors, not institutional investors. When it comes to regulation, the thought process there is that retail investors are not sophisticated relative to institutional investors and hence need more protection. So government regulators and non-government regulators obviously worry more about retail investors. Prudential supervision, I have alluded to this earlier. This refers to the concept that regulators want to promote financial stability and reduce system-wide risk. Now, how do regulators try to do that? Generally through diversification of assets, through adequate capitalization. This means that entities such as banks and other financial institutions are forced to have a certain minimum level of capital. Those who have followed the financial crises in the last few decades will note that a lot of crises can be attributed to excessive leverage. So to reduce risk, one of the most important actions that can be taken is more capital. But from the industry perspective, there might be pushback because capital is perceived to be more expensive. So continuing with possible actions, encouraging firms to monitor their risks, and sufficient supervision are also mechanisms to promote financial stability and reduce system-wide risks. Next, cost-benefit analysis of regulation. The idea is fairly straightforward, that obviously regulation comes with some cost, but the benefit should outweigh the cost. Now, what this segment of the reading encourages regulators to do is to constantly improve the measurement of costs and the measurement of benefits, because clearly this is not an easy thing to do. How do you measure the cost of regulation? How do you measure the benefit of regulation? So one suggestion is to use economic principles. The reading doesn't spend too much time explaining how this is done, but nevertheless it's a general point to keep in mind. A few important terms: regulatory burden and net regulatory burden. So regulatory burden essentially is the cost of regulation. Net regulatory burden considers both the cost of regulation as well as the benefit. Now, when we talk about cost of regulation, clearly there is a implementation cost. So for example, the cost of compliance lawyers when a given set of regulation is enacted, so that would be considered an implementation cost, a cost that is explicit, that is visible. But then there are also some implicit or indirect costs that also need to be viewed. Now, take a very simple example. Let's say that in a given country, the listing requirements on the stock exchange are extremely cumbersome. So obviously one needs to have listing requirements so as to create transparency and make it obvious for investors, or make it easy for investors to evaluate. But what if those listing requirements are excessive? Now, there will be some cost associated with paying lawyers to help out, but an indirect cost might be that a lot of companies will decide not to list. So when regulation is being considered, one should also try to estimate the indirect costs. Unanticipated costs means that the costs that, as the term implies, goes beyond what was anticipated. So for example, if a regulation is being enacted and the anticipation or expectation is that X number of additional lawyers will be needed. But if it turns out that once the law is enacted, we really have 10x lawyers who are needed. So that extra 9x would be unanticipated costs. Now, given the possibility for unanticipated costs, clearly it makes sense to also do some retrospective analysis. What this means essentially is you have enacted some regulation, you then on a periodic basis need to go back and look at whether that regulation actually had the desired effect, whether the cost was along the lines of what you had estimated, and so on. Now, this also brings up the point of sunset provisions, which has been recommended by some people. Basically, a sunset provision says that when a law is enacted, there should be a provision that says that this law will automatically terminate at a given point in time, or more precisely, that after, let's say, 5 years, the law needs to be reconsidered. So this will enforce the lawmaker to consider the cost benefit over the 5 years, and only if the cost benefit is positive or is acceptable is this law essentially re-enacted. And now section 6, analysis of regulation. This is a somewhat long section in the reading, but from a testability perspective, there are just a few basic points you need to know. Firstly, that as an analyst, when you evaluate regulation, you should evaluate the impact of regulation in the context of a framework. This simply means that you need to understand what regulations are currently in place and the impact of those regulations. You also need to understand how future regulations will impact the target entities. Target entities are, let's say, the firms that you want to evaluate. So, for example, if you are an analyst in the 1970s and you are evaluating the funds market, the mutual funds market, then when Regulation Q was enacted in the 1970s, which put limits on the amount of interest that banks could pay depositors, then a lot of money moved into the money market mutual funds. So clearly this was a big bonus for this industry, and an analyst who could predict this regulation, could see it coming, and could correctly estimate the impact of this regulation would obviously be doing a good job. Tobacco industry, again, a heavily regulated industry, so a good analyst should be able to figure out what possible regulations might be imposed on this industry in the future and the impact of those regulations on the industry. If you are evaluating a company that is heading or is essentially a natural monopoly, then you can expect some level of price controls or some limits on the profit rates that can be charged. So again, without getting into details, the important point is that analysts should be able to evaluate the impact of regulation on the industry or the entities that he is studying. So that is it. We have completed this reading. In fact, we have completed the segment on economics. Your job now is to do the practice problems. Here we only have 6 practice problems, so make sure you do those. And there is one slight issue in question number 5, where I think the curriculum has made a small typo. In question 5, where it says most likely an unanticipated effect, I think what they really mean to say is unintended effect. So just make that little correction and then attempt question number 5. So that's it. Good luck with your studies.